And with this, I will give the floor to the moderator for the final plenary, Mr. David Riley, the UK Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the Conference on Disarmament and the Chair of the Mine Action Support Group. David, take it away.
Thank you very much. I confess I'm not used to the glamour that comes with the NDM conference and the colouring. My apologies, even with my glasses on, I couldn't see many of you at the back of the room. I would just note that there is space near the front, so if you wanted to bring your nameplates forward, if not too inappropriate, then please do get closer to the conversation. Look, I don't need to make the business case to you for mine action. We know that business case and that need is strong indeed. The need is growing as the resource envelope is reducing. And that's really sort of the thrust behind this panel today. We need to look at alternative, innovative sources of funding if we are to respond collectively to the very real challenge that we continue to face globally in terms of mine action need. For the last 5 years, the UK has been looking at ways that we can diversify funding to the mine action sector. Our work on outcomes-based finance, including the successful minefields to rice fields project in Cambodia, which was showcased at a side event earlier today, I understand. We see the potential for outcomes-based mechanisms to attract private sector funding, both commercial and philanthropic. And by sequencing mine action clearance and land release with follow-on livelihood support, they also have the potential to drive stronger impact for benefiting communities and creating better value for money. The UK is committed to taking this work forward, and we are working with, and indeed we are proud to support, the GICHD's Innovative Finance Secretariat alongside other interested parties. And let me put on record my appreciation to the EU and Netherlands for the support they have provided to the GICHD Secretariat. So in the next 75 minutes, this panel will bring together humanitarian, development, economic and financial perspectives to explore how mine action approaches can be reframed to unlock private investment and other funding streams crucially, without compromising humanitarian principles. We were supposed to, you may have seen on your original schedules that we were supposed to have 4 panelists. Regrettably, Mr. Abdul Mahid, Director of DAFA in Afghanistan, has not been able to make it for personal reasons, but we do have 3 very distinguished panelists with us today. So we have to my right, Dmytro Panshin, who is head of the Humanitarian Demining Department at the Ministry of Economy, Environment and Agriculture of Ukraine. I have to my far left Mr. Amir Omaragic, Peace and Security Cluster Director at UNOPS, and then to my left, Maria Mashan Rocamoro, Innovative Finance Advisor at GICHD, and someone that we are proud to support through our funding for the Innovative Finance Secretariat. We're going to start with Dmytro, if we may. And the question we open with, Dmytro, is how did you drive cost effectiveness in mine action in Ukraine?
Дякую за запитання. І я хотів би розпочати в першу чергу з викликів, які постали перед Україною у 2022 році, а це саме 174 тисячі квадратних кілометрів, які потребували обстеження та розмінування. На сьогодні, звісно, ми зменшили ці виклики, і в подальшому я вже скажу, яких результатів ми досягли. Отже, в 2022 році, після деокупації частини території України, перед нами постала завдача зробити швидке і дешеве розмінування територій. Щоб, зокрема, цей процес був пріоритизований, а також контрольований. Уряд поставив перед Міністерством економіки завдання розробити відповідні інструменти. Ми зробили програму «Гуманітарне розмінування». Це державна бюджетна програма. Основне завдання її – спрямувати ефективно бюджетні кошти, які надходять від наших партнерів, зокрема в рамках програми Ukraine Facility, це допомога Євросоюзу, спрямувати ці кошти ефективно на розмінування. Відповідно, нами було розроблено таку бюджетну програму. Її завдання – це реалізація шляхом провадження механізму подачі заявку фермера до Центру гуманітарного розмінування, відповідних відкритих торгів земельної ділянки, залучення приватних операторів в сектор і, відповідно, розмінування. Але саме основний момент – це все ж таки те, що нам треба швидко і дешево розмінувати менше всього забруднені земельні ділянки, такі, які ми можемо пустити одразу в обіг. Механізм доволі простий. Фермер через Державний аграрний реєстр подає заявку на розмінування своєї земельної ділянки. Центр гуманітарного розмінування перевіряє її вимогам, які встановлені нормативним актом уряду. Далі ця земельна ділянка проходить перевірку та потрапляє на відкриті аукціони, де оператори змагаються за неї в відкритих торгах. Після цього певні кошти перераховуються на рахунок Центру гуманітарного розмінування. Далі вони йдуть оператору після завершення робіт з розмінування. Завершується все відповідно контролем якості та передачею відповідного сертифікату. На сьогодні в рамках програми вже було розміновано 15 тисяч гектарів. Це вже 72 фермери, які отримали свої земельні ділянки для проведення робіт і обробітку. Оскільки програма працює виключно з підтвердженими забрудненими земельними ділянками, розмінування 15 тисяч гектарів, зокрема з ціною приблизно 1500 євро, для нас є суттєвим досягненням уряду. Цього року ми плануємо також очистити земельні ділянки не менш. Ми вже маємо заявки на понад 15 тисяч на цей рік. На сьогодні, крім того, у нас є 130 операторів протимінної діяльності, серед яких 30 постійно беруть участь у програмі з розмінування. Це саме комерційні оператори, які проводять діяльність прибуткову. В цьому році у нас також закладено 2 мільярди гривень, що в еквіваленті на євро є 40 мільйонів євро. Як ми це зробили? По-перше, це чіткі виписані правила. Грамотно побудована система сприяє умовам нарощення, спрощення і використання грошей. Основні її складові. Варто звернути увагу, що у нас все починається з сертифікації операторів протимінної діяльності, які допускаються до онлайн-аукціонів. Ці оператори, як я вже казав, змагаються за право розміновувати земельну ділянку, тим самим зменшуючи її вартість. І все завершується контролем якості. Це все прописані процеси. Конкуренція – це встановлення очікуваної вартості та відкритих торгів сприяють зниженню відповідної ціни і для бюджету економію коштів. Така економія на сьогодні досягає в середньому 17%. Отже, встановлення очікуваної вартості розмінування стало для нас одною з основою формування ринку. І тут нам треба було поєднати потреби уряду і, як я вже казав, швидкого та дешевого вивільнення земель із фактичними витратами на розмінування. Ми провадили публічні дискусії з операторами протимінної діяльності щодо ціни на розмінування, під час яких ми працювали з різними баченнями, зокрема і іноді суперечними, оскільки ми враховували також позиції міжнародних операторів протимінної діяльності, але в той же час треба звернути увагу, що міжнародні організації містять відмінні витрати, ніж комерційні оператори. Таким чином, це різні види діяльності, і не можна поєднувати ту ціну, яку встановлюється в рамках бюджетної програми, з тою ціною, по якої працюють наші партнери. Так, у 2024 році Міністерство економіки видало відповідні методичні рекомендації щодо визначення очікуваної вартості земельної ділянки, в формулу якої увійшли як прямі витрати, а також інші витрати, коефіцієнт складності, а також коефіцієнт прибутковості. Основна ідея полягала в тому, що ми не маємо витрачати час на сильно забруднені земельні ділянки, оскільки ми знаходимося в конфлікті досі, і досі йде війна. Тому ми розпочали розмінування найменш забруднених земельних ділянок. Все це сприяє швидкому економічному відновленню та забезпечує продовольчу безпеку, зайнятість людей, додаючи до працюючої економіки ланцюги переробки та логістики. Послідовність. Нам дозволяє чіткий інструмент Ukraine Facility передбачати певні кошти та суми на потреби розмінування, за що ми вдячні Європейському Союзу. Крім того, залучення заявників, ми працюємо над тим, щоб можливість програми постійно вдосконалювалась. Це стосується і розширення її дії програми на інші земельні ділянки, не лише фермерів як товариства, але й одноосібних власників. Наприклад, план розмінування, також ми складаємо щорічні плани розмінування, і для цього нам потрібно пріоритизовувати земельні ділянки. І отже, в цьому році завдяки системі GRID, це тестова платформа для пріоритизації, ми розробили певний порядок земельних ділянок, пріоритизованих, відповідно, які були включені в план гуманітарного розмінування. Для визначення ділянок, які були включені в цей план, ми накладали межі ймовірно забрудненої ділянки, враховували соціальні, економічні, безпекові, а також екологічні коефіцієнти, визначали відповідний бал пріоритетності і подавали їх в план гуманітарного розмінування. Загальна площа таких земельних ділянок вже склала 5300 гектарів. Це землі виключно сільськогосподарської діяльності, які потребують розмінування вже і зараз і підпадають під умови нашої програми. Відповідно до операційного плану виконання національної стратегії пріоритизації, цей план має завершитися у 2026 році. Ми сподіваємося, що ми все встигнемо розмінувати, і у нас вистачить на все грошей, запланованих в цьому році. Дякую.
Thank you, Dimitro. And I think that's another great illustration of the leadership and the innovation that Ukraine has been showing, not only in the technological sphere, but also now in the sort of the financing sphere, but also a very powerful message for us in terms of the important work you are doing to support socioeconomic growth within Ukraine, but also redeveloping that agricultural sector, which is so important for Ukraine, but also for food security more broadly, for example, in North Africa. So thank you for setting that out so clearly. We're going to turn to Amira. Amira, now as Director of the Peace and Security Cluster at UNOPS, you have a leadership role both in New York and in the field. And UNOPS, of course, has much experience with procurement. So how do you think that we move from measuring what mine action costs to proving what it unlocks at scale and in real time?
Thank you, David. Thank you for the opportunity to offer some of the UNOPS perspectives. And Dimitro, a very interesting case where you've explained also how procurement is linked directly to results, which is really what we're trying to unpack here. When I looked at the topic for this discussion, the cost of mine action, I take it as a bit of a challenge and a trick question in itself, because essentially we all have to connect our activities not only and reflect them not only as costs but as benefits, as results. And beyond the immediate results, how anything we do becomes an investment multiplier. So I think in the way we capture the story of mine action during this conference and many other conferences, and this sector in particular has recognized that link between activities, outputs, outcomes that's critical. And I'm glad that we are at that stage unpacking even some other potential options to access additional funding. So I'll just talk a little bit about that narrative. For UNOPS as implementation agency, we of course provide project management services. Procurement is one important element, but we absolutely, as any good implementer, need to understand what are the outcomes we are trying to achieve, what are we planning to achieve, and then obviously what are we able to capture and learn from that. In this process, it's innovation that helps us greatly, and over the last couple of years, we've explored that area in particular. I'll give an example, which I think most of the people or everybody in this room will understand. IMSMA, the fantastic work of many operators, GICHD in particular in this area, has given us tools to better plan, prioritize, and implement mine action activities in difficult places, in rugged terrain, but it also allowed us to overlay different data sets to actually help that prioritization be better. We are no different. We power ANMAS's information management system, but over the past year or so, we've really explored this space, predominantly through our partnerships with academia and organizations present in this room. So that example deals with a sector that is well underserved. It's victim assistance, survivor care. We are looking at test and pilot case to project the cost of not only immediate assistive technology type of projects to help survivors, but survivor care throughout life. That partnership I want to highlight AT-Scale. My colleagues are here in the room, UNICEF, Humanity Inclusion, ANMAS, is giving us such a strong advocacy tool. It's no longer, we no longer stop at conceptualizing that injuries lead to suffering and the care is required. We can now predict with high degree of confidence how would that care look like over a long period of time, and therefore can also engage in the debates about reintegration, pathways into the health sector, and all the rest of the fantastic work that victim assistance focused organizations do.
Thank you, Amir. And we may come back to that point later in the conversation around sort of measuring the recovery, the impact after clearance. And I think you have some interesting examples from Afghanistan that we may pick up slightly later in our conversation. But I want to turn to Maria now. And as I said, Maria is the Innovative Finance Advisor at the GICHD, where Maria leads work on innovative financing approaches for mine action. And Maria, your work focuses on how the sector can diversify and strengthen its funding mechanisms and sources, while of course trying to make sure that we protect and safeguard humanitarian principles, but also how we can potentially link mine action to recovery, to socioeconomic opportunity and longer-term sustainable development outcomes. So what does it mean in practice to move from a one-size-fits-all grant model to a more strategic financing approach? And I think you're going to also give us a presentation as well. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and also to indeed the support of the UK, the Netherlands and the European Union to help us get our work kick-started. And thank you, of course, to the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine, because they have been salient partners for us in starting to define how it can look for the mine action sector to diversify sources of funding. I'm mindful this is the last plenary, so I won't maybe go through all the stack of slides that I had. If there is one item that I would like for us to ponder upon, and it answers the question also of how do we reframe the cost of mine action, maybe it's a tripartite thing. First, a bit of a reflection on funding trends. Second, understanding what do we mean by engaging private capital and the different types of capital we might be looking at, and then knowing what it will take to change from an reliance on, some could say, over-reliance on the grand international grant model to something alternative, bearing in mind that not all mine actions interventions are the same. There are different economic incentives and there are different characteristics. This is based on data of the Landmine Monitor that I know that we are all familiar with. It's not a multi-annual consolidated trend yet, but I think it gives us an indication of what we expect is going to continue happening. So it's the issue of 2025, and the relative decrease or increase compares 2024 to 2023. So we speak sometimes about the funding gap. Of course, there are growing needs. We have spoken of the case of Ukraine earlier today. We had panels on Syria, on Gaza, other countries that have issues with legacy contamination. We see that for the international funding part, there is indeed a decrease, and that has been picked up in some contexts by national budgets. So it's not only an element of gap, which for international funding is true, is also a shift or an element of matching. Where is the funding going towards and for how long? One problem that peers tend to highlight is start-stop inefficiencies, because the funding cycles are short, 12, 24 months, and then a new grant has to be renegotiated. So how can we build a bit more stability into the system? And then a change in narrative, also building on what you said of now is about demonstrating outcome-based funding, demonstrating impact, and moving to this capturing the socio-economic impact of mine action as an enabler for reconstruction and recovery. I saw on a slide, though, that was the winning answer, the one answer, which will link more mine action to reconstruction and recovery. This is a graph that we did together with my teammate that I invite you also to greet at the end of this discussion team. And this is probably how we will reframe the cost of mine action towards risk and return, to see what kind of funding scheme can respond to the needs of the mine action intervention, to the economic incentives that might be there, and to answer, I think, one of the underlying questions, which is how do we fund for public goods? Or how do we capture this kind of socioeconomic returns when there is a public good element in mine action? If you see it, well, I have it here and I have it there, so look at it where it's more visible for you. There is the purely private capital that I think we have been entertaining or discussing during these days and even in prior years that provides money at a commercial rate, as if you were getting a loan from a commercial bank. There is a cost to that. And then there is what we call, or it is called, concessional finance, which is capital that is provided by actors that are willing to be more patient, more lenient, or pursue objectives that are not only return on investment when it comes to providing this funding. Our conclusion is that the mine action sector it's more so below market conditions in that area of the graphite, which is not per se a negative. It is only the reality we have to grapple with and we need to define to be able to provide the right solution. With my team, we are starting to explore how we could strike the right partnerships in that space. We think that potentially multilateral development banks, going back to the slide of question, could be suitable partners, and we are starting to define what it will take to bring mine action into these broader recovery and reconstruction discussions, notably also with the government of Ukraine. Why do we do this? In terms of return on investment, that is capital you have to pay back, and you have to pay back in competitive terms. So soon, sufficiently, sufficient profit. For the concessional aspect, we think that when we discuss about quantifying mine action or the business case for mine action, we are not strictly speaking of financial return. We are more so speaking about this enabling component. Of course, the humanitarian aspect is important enough, but to enter in these funding discussions, it's good to be very aware of this layer. So these positive socioeconomic externalities, this means it has a spillover on recovery of infrastructure, agriculture, even real estate. This is the markup, this is the element that we want to capture and that we think will match with concessional finance. So when we do build this narrative of how we can correct a bit this over-reliance on only international grants, we can be able to use that argument or to quantify that aspect and go to that part of the market. Again, I think that element of understanding where we belong in these potential partnerships is interesting to make the most out of them. I think that probably I will stay at this with the slides, but if I were to give you or to leave you in this last plenary maybe with a phrase or what is exactly what we are trying to do for innovative finance, that is a layer that can be applied to public funds. How can we use public money differently? And again, I think the first trend is important. There is an element or there is an argument to say, okay, there is a greater contribution from national budgets lately, even if international assistance is declining, or that can be applied to these new partnerships primarily with concessional finance according to our analysis. It is not about financializing the mine action sector per se, it's about engaging in this matching exercise. Okay, the typical one-size-fits-all grants doesn't suffice any longer, and it might create certain incentives that are not ideal. How can we have different tools for different cases? And these tools can be blended finance, these tools can be guarantees. We have done some exploratory work on how bond issuance can help. I know these are a bit technicalities. We don't want to take too long, and of course our team is always available to provide information. We have shared a glossary of innovative finance terminology in 3 languages, French, Spanish, and English, already on the NDM website. For any follow-up question on how do these guarantees look like, can you please repeat the concessional capital aspect? What is this matching exercise? Please never hesitate to reach out to us.
Thank you, Maria. I mean, I think, as you've pointed out there, that the challenge is not only the funding gap that we've all discussed repeatedly this week, but also the financing mismatch. And one of the themes we covered in some of our conversations in the Mine Action Support Group yesterday, the open session, was the role that mine action can play both in building peace and security, crisis response, humanitarian response, but also long-term socioeconomic development. And the financing need may differ depending on the characteristic of the demining. And that's why I think this message on innovative financing is so important. But as you've set out in your model, which I think I would summarize as sort of land value restored, income generated, long-term socioeconomic benefits. An element of that, of course, is how do we measure that recovery? And I'm going to perhaps come back to Amir here, because I know that there is an example of clearance in Kandahar, Amir, that perhaps that you can speak to in this area. Back to you.
Thanks, David. And pity our colleague from Afghanistan couldn't join because obviously the work of Afghan and international NGOs in that space has been critical for us to be able to tell these stories. So in Afghanistan, we were able to observe the changes over a longer period of time, not just post-demining impact assessment 6 months after demining, but it was really looking at a period of over 10 years. It was actually 13 years. Specific parts of Kandahar demined, and with all the output type of statistics of square meterage, number of minefields, items found, the typical mine action situation in Afghanistan. But what is interesting is then what came after, and we were able to observe geospatial information, satellite imagery, use of AI for analysis of the buildings and infrastructure constructed there. Around 4,000 houses, 1,500 apartments, 9 schools, a hospital, and around $1 billion of investment that followed mine action. So again, back to the narrative and the stories, this sector has been better and better at demonstrating this. We can go further, and the technology is here to help us. I must not miss to note in this endeavor of using new technology, partnerships are critical. We do not pretend to know everything. We have a fantastic team of data scientists, but we partner up with MIT, Carnegie Mellon University, London School of Economics, other universities who would basically give us very, very excited PhD students, and our job is obviously to work and guide them to complicated problems. They love problem solving, and we've seen some great results out of this collaboration.
Thank you, Amir. I'm going to come out to you in the audience soon, but I have a couple of questions, perhaps, that Maria or Dimitra might want to pick up, and I'm going to sort of challenge and push a little bit through these questions. The first is, of course, that one of the questions or the concerns that I hear from stakeholders is that the minute you start to talk about what is perceived as the commercialization of this demining sector, is you begin to hear concerns around losing sight of the humanitarian need, and in particular concerns around respecting, for example, international mine clearance standards to ensure that the territory remains safe and secure. So I think, how, Dimitra, in your experience, sort of how do we try to make sure that we address that risk effectively, that we are still operating in line with those elements? And I'll allow you to think about that, Dimitra, 1 second, as I'll come to Maria with another challenging question, potentially. I think in my career I've come across green bonds, I've come across humanitarian bonds. It is not a new tool. They exist already through many of the international development banks. And I just wonder, anecdotally perhaps in your conversations with actors in the private sector or international finance sector, how much appetite or bandwidth or space is there for this approach to demining? So perhaps I'll come to you first, Dimitra, and then back to you, Maria.
Дякую за запитання. Дуже цікаве запитання. В першу чергу хочу звернути увагу про те, що міжнародні стандарти в сфері протимінної діяльності для України є основою для розробки своїх стандартів. І, зокрема, це передбачено відповідним законом про протимінну діяльність в Україні. Тому на сьогодні, загалом, якщо брати технічний процес розмінування, він повністю відповідає вимогам міжнародних стандартів, відповідно забезпечує якість розмінування однаково як комерційного оператора, так і того, хто заходить з гуманітарними намірами розміновувати Україну. В даному контексті ми розуміємо, що у нас дуже великі виклики. Кількість гуманітарних організацій, які у нас працюють, вона сягає 8 зараз організацій. Але в той же час треба подолати ці наслідки дуже швидко. І, як я вже казав, ми не можемо чекати дуже великого часу для того, щоб повертати треба в обіг земельні ділянки. Це економічна сталість, а ми здебільшого аграрна країна. Однак, в той же час, ринок, ми розуміємо, що він також залежить від грошей наших партнерів, оскільки Європейський Союз виділив нам на розмінування певну частину коштів. Ми маємо її спрямовувати ефективно і прозоро. Тому і була розроблена ця програма. Я сподіваюся, що в подальшому ми знайдемо інструменти, як спрямувати і інші кошти, не лише державні, а й партнерів, так само на ефективність в розмінуванні. В той же час ніша для гуманітарних організацій, вона доволі відкрита. І вона досі широка, оскільки гуманітарні організації, вони здебільшого роблять комплексні проекти. Це не стосується лише очищення аграрних земель. У нас так само є забруднені ліси, у нас так само є потреба в відновленні комплексно громад. Це і надання допомоги постраждалим, це і ОРІ, це різні види діяльності. Тому гуманітарна складова, вона присутня і вона забезпечується в першу чергу так само, як паралельно на рівні із комерційними організаціями.
Thanks, Dimitro. And then back to you, Maria, for the point around sort of the interest and the slack within the market, if you like, for this area.
It is a very good question, and I think it brings us back to what kind of actor are we addressing? In the first conversations we have had, I think we have a technical working group, and the development bank that is the most active member is the European Investment Bank, or that has an impact investing development arm. They seem to be more interested in guarantees for the time being, which means that a public entity or an international donor offers to pay if something doesn't go as planned, if a risk materializes, and that can ease the lending conditions. I think one important point we need to have in mind when we move towards other kinds of funding mechanisms, for me it's more so the distinction between repayable and non-repayable capital. Grants are not repayable, and some philanthropic capital might be not repayable. Others will be, and in different conditions. And I think for us is to strike the balance precisely in reconciliation with humanitarian and development priorities of, is that relative cost worth undertaking? And I think that with a proper calculation of the socio-economic benefits, then we can undertake that conversation. But in terms of appetite, bonds have been already tried and existed, so the fact that there is a precedent can ease certain actors into it, and there are certain blueprints we can follow. I think that at least for the conversations we have advanced with the most, they are interested in guarantees, and they are also interested in projects that clearly have that economic development potential and an important degree of national ownership. At the end of the day, if we talk about this concessional capital, the public sector will eventually have to step in to repay it. But the hope is that by having a better fiscal space, or by having reduced the cost for the society of having a hampered economy or significant public healthcare problems or others, there are even linkages, as we all know, between mine action and environmental concerns. By reducing those negative externalities and improving the economic development of the society, you can face them. For me, echoing what Dimitro was saying, understanding this segmentation, we have less money for grants, to put it very simplistically. We need to prioritize the quote-unquote purely humanitarian, neatly public good interventions for which they are very required, and we can discuss if we want to be more specific about outcomes, if we want to introduce certain performance indicators, that its own conversation, and it has merit. And then, for those interventions that have economic potential, can we reduce the dependency on grants to ensure there is continuity, to ensure there are these positive spillovers, to ensure that on top of mine action, or thanks to mine action, there are these infrastructures in the broad sense that are built. I think for me that would be the distinction. So we speak a lot about private and non-private. Maybe we can think about payback and not payback, and how can we be better prepared to understand that trade-off and to make those deals in a way that is advantageous for the mine action sector and respectful of the humanitarian component.
Thank you, Maria. We're going to come out to you now in the audience with the question of how do we attract new investors to the mine sector. But before I open up the mic more broadly, I think I have here in my notes that we already have a few organizations who've expressed interest in speaking on this issue. So we will start, I believe, with Becky Wicks from Halo Trust, and then Narmina Streshenets from Save the Children. So do we have Becky from Halo?
Hello, yes.
You feel a long way away, Becky, but thank you. I can see you waving. So the mic is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So, I think at Halo we see very clearly that mine action is at quite a pivotal moment. The scale of contamination is outpacing available resources, as already discussed. And despite the significant and continued commitment of our public donors, which remains the foundation of our work, and we're very grateful for that support, we do also recognise that the funding climate currently is becoming a lot more constrained, and we won't close the gap by relying on public funding alone. So in response to that, Halo's been pivoting towards private fundraising and stronger public-private partnerships to complement our institutional base. And one of the key lessons we've learned from this is that it's not just about asking for support differently, it's really about framing mine action differently and clearly. To attract the private capital, we need to clearly articulate the role of mine action in enabling economic recovery, stability, and growth. And the value proposition takes time to build, and it needs to be grounded in evidence and our real outcomes. But what we've also kind of noted is national leadership is really critical here. So in Angola, where we work, we've seen really strong leadership from the government and ANAM, not only in financing clearance, but in convening the public, private, and humanitarian actors around, a shared vision and purpose, including around clearance around key economic corridors, such as the Lobito corridor. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge and thank them for that leadership, because that's been really instrumental. But at the same time, we found that unlocking new funding, it really requires us to be disciplined on our cost as well. So prioritising high-impact tasks, improving productivity at scale, which relies on making better use of technology and data to maximise that impact per dollar in the long run. And ultimately, if we can kind of clearly demonstrate that mine action underpins livelihoods, infrastructure, and economic growth, then we can create a proposition where humanitarian outcomes and investment interests reinforce one another. So for us in Halo, and speaking from the Africa region, we kind of hope to continue to build on this in Angola, but also across our other programs in Halo as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. And that point on mutually reinforcing is a very important one for us to remember. Narmina, I think, in the front row over here, please.
Thank you. I would like to speak about innovation and cost of innovation in supporting survivors, because they are central to recovery and reconstruction. I think something that skips our attention is the impact on children, and in 2024, children accounted for nearly half, 46% of all recorded mine and explosive remnants of war casualties. It means that every second casualty is a child. And in our recent analysis, from 2020 until 2024, 50,000 children around the world in conflict zones were killed or injured, and 60% of them were injured or killed by explosive weapons. That means that to address this challenge, to heal the community, to heal their family, for them to recover and contribute to the economy and get proper education, these needs need to be addressed. And the situation is quite dire in many contexts. In Afghanistan, we see a child being killed by a landmine or unexploded ordnance every day. In Ukraine, every 10th casualty of landmine or explosive remnants of war is a child as well. So in Gaza, this is the largest cohort of child amputees with over 40,000 children being injured and thousands with their limb loss. So we understand that children today will be adults tomorrow, and the family and community will bear this burden for years to come. So how exactly this need is addressed? We see that last year 75% of mine action funding went on clearance, and only 5% was spent on victim assistance, and not even all countries got direct assistance for, I'm not even speaking about children, generally, victim assistance funding. So just to share a couple of solutions that Save the Children is now experimenting with, and they are not that much, they do not require that much funding, but they already proved their efficiency. One is innovation and partnership with academic institutions, and Save the Children is a partner with Imperial College London, one of the leading research institutions, and we co-founded the Center for Pediatric Blast Research. And through our partnership of 3 years, essentially, the PhD research has already delivered the low-cost prosthetic knee that is now has already completed clinical trials and now is going to the first deployment before rollout. And basically the cost of a PhD studentship is very low, but the cost of cost-effective, reliable solution is very high, specifically for people. Another example is the example of private sector partnership, and Save the Children partnered with Amparo Prosthetics, which is an innovative enterprise to roll out the remoldable prosthetics that can be changed and fit on one day up to 5 times. So, and we know that for children and younger generation, basically the growth is the main problem. So you need to replace and recover and spend a lot of time for these kinds of programs. So this just brings us to the major, I guess, recommendation to states and various mine action actors to prioritize victim assistance in recovery considerations and explore new creative ways for data collection and finding solutions for research and in recovery and rehabilitation of survivors. Thank you.
Thank you, Narmina. An important reminder to us that in many ways, our most valuable asset is our human capital and our people. So thank you for reminding us of that. I have one more speaker who had said in advance they'd like to speak, which was at scale, I believe. Is this gentleman here with the...
Yeah. I'm upstairs. Thank you. And I fully support the last intervention of Save the Children, especially because children require more support in the field of assistive technology. AT-Scale is dedicated to, is a unit and a program implemented by UNOPS. And our focus is on assistive products and the associated services that require most of the time a large proportion of survivors. We had a session this afternoon regarding victim assistance in Syria, during which a survivor used this say, moving from being a victim to become a survivor. And that's the purpose of the mine action sector for the pillar of victim assistance. Our work should not stop only at collecting data on victims, but also to continue to analyze and to prioritize intervention, and for the mine action sector to advocate for more services. And for that, we need to calculate the cost of victim assistance, the cost for the international community, but also for the government on a longer-term perspective. And to do that, as mentioned by Amir, we work at UNOPS on using artificial intelligence to go inside the data set of victims. We have thousands of lines of data on victims that we are not using enough, and we want to use these new tools to valorize the life of people behind the data. Each line is one person with specific needs, and in the mine action sector, we have never been able to put a cost on this life. And it's important to start to do it now with the tools that are emerging, and I fully also support the development of emerging technologies in general in the field of assistive technology. We can take the example of prosthetics, but I would like to remind that 20% of survivors have also sensorial impairment regarding vision or hearing. So victim assistance is not only about physical rehabilitation, it's a lot of psychological and psychosocial support to be provided as well, and that has a cost. So let's use all our coordination fora and all the tools available to advocate and to put a cost on the need of the people affected by landmines, EO, and IEDs. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you. Apologies I didn't see you when I first gave you the floor at the back there. We're going to open up the conversation more broadly. I think I saw Intertrade expressed an interest in speaking. I can see you there, sir. And then others, if you'd like to speak, then please do put your nameplates vertically or wave at me. But Intertrade, so you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you all for your comments. So it's been a great honor to be in Ukraine working on humanitarian demining, and I really appreciate all your perspective. And this, I think, would be part of the conversation that you were discussing, Ms. Roquemar, on public versus private versus concessional financing. And I've discussed this concept with a number of folks, but when you think about funding humanitarian demining, it's something that's not typically bankable. But if you look at a mechanism like a debt for demining swap, where you take the 160 billion of Ukraine's sovereign liabilities and say, hey, we can go to international creditors and say there's a pathway to getting all of something as opposed to, part of something as opposed to all of nothing, by doing a swap where we say we take down some of the external sovereign liabilities in exchange for demining. That way you increase the productivity of land, you achieve agricultural objectives, you build infrastructure and residences back, and you have a stronger probability of international creditors getting made whole on, say, $75 billion worth of liabilities, as opposed to, a longer time frame on 100 billion. So you could take the amortization out, take the principal down, and do something that helps Ukraine and helps the international community. What would be your thoughts on, a mechanism like that, like a debt for demining swap? Do you think that would have any traction?
I suspect that's a question for Maria, but I will just see whether any, certainly it's not a question I can answer, but I might just look around the room and see whether anyone else would like to speak. Or I see, there's someone at the back. Forgive me, you will have to introduce yourself, but the second row from the back, and then we'll come to Denmark afterwards. Yeah, thank you. Not Denmark, sorry. You took up my invitation to come to the front. Thank you. Gentleman at the back in the second row near the stage, please. Please introduce yourself when you speak.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Charles Frisby, I'm the head of operations at Global Clearance Solutions. Many thanks to the panel. I think if I heard your words correctly, Ambassador, you mentioned that there's a perception that commercial actors don't adhere to IMAS, the International Mine Action Standards. I think, we'd be out of work pretty quickly if that was the case. And let's remember that, as Mr. Dimitro has said, national standards derive directly from the International Mine Action Standards. I think there's a very clear and obvious interface between commercial and non-profit in all of this. I've spent all of my career in humanitarian and UN work. Essentially, one of the very clear contributions that we make, in our case, is in the development of hardware essentially mechanical land release systems have been developed by commercial operators. In the current sort of day, drone survey is a big one. There's significant investment by commercial actors from multiple countries in that regard, which is contributing directly to humanitarian mine action. And the other very obvious one is detection systems. There's a whole array of detection systems that are largely developed by commercial actors in the first instance, which are used in all fields of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And just to perhaps reassure you or correct if I wasn't clear, I was certainly not suggesting there is a sector of the private sector who are not respecting international standards. I think what I was saying is when we have this dialogue in Geneva about looking at this sort of innovative financing and working increasingly in public-private partnerships, the sorts of questions we get back is that sort of question. But thank you for addressing it head on. A gentleman here on the fourth row near the steps.
Thank you for the microphone. Just a quick introduction. I'm Karl Strobel. I work for MAT Kosovo, but I also have the dubious privilege, I guess, of having worked for 17 years in Wall Street in structured finance. This is actually a very fitting last panel because a lot of what was discussed in the overall conference, a lot of these priorities actually come together here about what are measurables, what are the outcomes we want, how do we become more efficient, how do we drive costs down, and so on. And of course, in the meanwhile, it's been sort of in the corridors and whispered about. The money has started to quietly leave the room, year after year. So I apologize if I address only the narrow aspect of innovative finance. I think a lot of progress has been made since Tokyo, and compliments to Maria particularly in introducing a common language, which is how it all starts. How do in Tokyo we were talking about front loading, and not everybody kind of understood what that means, and we're getting there. I think we still have a long way to go to attract private capital, and I've just 4 very brief points, or hopefully brief, I should say. Very important what Maria also said, private sector versus concessional finance, right? Now, concessional, let's be honest, because I think we were still a bit gentle about, the topics that we'll have to address to really get to the point where innovative finance gets released. Concessional finance isn't finance. It's money that doesn't look for a return. So if we focus on innovative finance, let's go straight to the target, which is the money that wants to be paid back in some shape or form. That doesn't make it necessarily debt. It could be paid back in kind of a formula where you could lose some if the outcomes aren't as intended, or where you could actually make some more if the outcomes exceed expectations. There are some hard choices to make. Again, other speakers have addressed them. Right? How do you measure the outcome in terms of impact on children, on what Maria calls socio-economic externalities? Right? Now, when somebody talks about finance and says socio-economic externalities, children, victim assistance, and so on, right? By the finance community, they are seen as socioeconomic externalities. And what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that if you have people who want their money back somehow, you have to measure those outcomes, quantify them, monetize them, have someone pay for them, right? And that means that you have an enforceable and collectible repayment agreement on socio-external realities, which is children, reducing number of deaths, and so on and so forth. I will leave it at that in the interest of brevity, but I do think we have to get a lot more comfortable with the language of finance, which is a little bit brutal, and somebody has to step in and make the make the measurables that we have all focused on over the last few days in terms of soft humanitarian language, quantifiable, enforceable, and collectible. Otherwise, the private sector money will not step in unless it is concessional. And on the last point, the concessional finance, that's a volatile pool, as we've all experienced over the last two years. The private sector pool of money is not. It's much, much deeper than anything this sector will ever need. So it's actually the much more interesting one. And I really wish you all of us, good luck to crack that nut. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, you make an important, I think as this conversation has shown with a couple of the interventions, I mean, one of the challenges we will have is being able to educate both sides of the debate, translate, humanitarian into financial engineering and financial engineering into, we talk different languages to a degree, which I think is at the heart of what you're talking about there. And we have to find a way of communicating in a transparent and in a clear and understandable way. I'm going to come back to our panel to respond to some of those remarks and the questions and offer any final thoughts. Perhaps I can start with you, Maria, because I think a couple of these questions were sort of more aimed towards your expertise. Then I will come to Amir, and then perhaps a last word for Dimitro.
And very interesting questions, very poignant one as well. To the colleague from Intertrade, whom I think has maybe moved, but happy to also rekindle the conversation at a later stage after the panel, if he will come back. We haven't yet looked into a debt swap for mine action. I think within a TOR, our mandate is to come up with a repository of alternatives, of innovative finance tools, but alternatives to grant funding. I think that one characteristic, and with all deference to the Ministry of Economy for the case of Ukraine, a distinctive positive factor is the national ownership of these kind of approaches and the understanding also and the direct contact with the Ministry of Economy. So there is potential. We will certainly have to analyze it in depth, but the understanding that there is a debt component is not far off for some modes of cooperation with private capital, which brings me to Klaus's point. It is true, Klaus, that I think concessional or even impact investing that we also talk about a lot in our space, this connection between humanitarian and economic development is not the biggest pool. For me, it's more about the trade-off or the associated cost, this capital that is paid to be paid back. How much can it be accommodated with the realities of the mine action operations and the priorities? And a comment maybe on having common language is a mantle that me and my team, we take upon ourselves to make both sides of the aisle understand each other. Mutual intelligibility, I've heard it being called, to know this language, to know these expectations. But it goes in both ways. I acknowledge that it can be a bit alienating to think, oh, this is an externality. What does that even mean? In our sector, you use impact, we use positive impacts. At the end of the day, part of the discussion we are having has to do a lot with public healthcare even. And that goes through economic development, or that goes through national ownership, or that goes to linking mine action to these other sectors, and the discussion about public goods and how much can it be done at non-concessional rates. So those were very, very fine points, somewhat technical. I know that there are different skill sets in the room, but connecting those dots within the understanding of what the priorities are for us is part of our work. So unfortunately, not yet a final answer for Intertrade, even though we do see the potential precisely for certain contexts, and to acquiesce indeed that there is still work to be done, and we shall continue pursuing it to the best of our ability. So thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you, Maria. Just for Amir and Dimitro, we do have another speaker who's asked for the floor, so I will give you the opportunity to respond to maybe any of the questions that came in that last round. Otherwise, you can save your final words. So Amir, is there anything you wanted to respond to specifically in that last round of questions? Okay, please go ahead.
Just briefly to thank Save the Children and AT-Scale for actually emphasizing victim assistance as an area that we constantly see is underserved and not recognized. It's a reminder to all of us that we're here also to lean forward and do our best to help all the children, all the civilians suffering across the world. And that's an impossible task, but that's also why this group and many operators out there trying to do their best believe in that cause. And thank you for highlighting again the need for tools, technologies there to help us. It's made quantum leaps literally in recent years, and we have a completely different experience as users. We no longer need to have IM officers next to us for every manager to make decisions. I think that experience is completely different. We can query and actually task some of these tools. We offer one of those tools. I know there's organizations here, and I'd simply like to invite anybody who would like to compare notes and see how do we crack some of those problems ourselves. Maybe if I can just wrap up from my side. Needs are bigger than resources we have. We are well aware of that. The way we tell the narrative of moving from activities to outcomes and impact has always mattered. Now it matters even more, and it needs to evolve. I know we can do it with the help of technology. Capturing it both in qualitative terms and quantitative is absolutely important. And I will come back to the points that you and some of the audience raised. The language we speak, outcomes can be explained in different terms. And essentially, it's also upon us to challenge ourselves to explain to the different audience, repayable, non-repayable pots of resources, how those outcomes look like. And I think if we crack that better than what we're doing right now, we'll have additional resources.
Thank you, Mir. I'm going to give the floor to Dimitro, and then we'll come back to France, and then one last chance for the panel to respond. But Dimitro, please, your response to that last round of questions.
Дякую. Насправді, про те, що були запитання, вони, не дивлячись на свої різні характери запитань, але вони все одно сходяться в протимінній діяльності, тому що, в першу чергу, це пріоритизація необхідності не лише розмінування, а й на допомоги постраждалим. Це визначення ключових пріоритетів для будь-якої держави, для будь-якого органу, який займається протимінною діяльністю. В той же час важливість розробки сталих інструментів надходження коштів, вона потрібна для того, щоб забезпечити виконання тих пріоритетів. В той же час ті ж самі машини, інструменти, інноваційні механізми – це все частини протимінної діяльності, які і мають якусь додану вартість, які є комерційними, але в той же час вони сприяють забезпеченню тих же самих пріоритетів держави по розмінуванню і забезпеченню її соціального розвитку. Все це об'єднується в одну модель, і важливо, щоб в кожній державі, в кожному органі були механізми координації цього всього і розуміння, як це працює. На сьогодні Міністерство економіки якраз і працює загалом над координацією всіх складових цих процесів, для того, щоб в кожному органі влади, який бере маленьку частинку, займається допомогою постраждалим, соціальним забезпеченням, в той же час розвитком і безпековою складовою, наприклад, поліція або ДСНС, вони всі координувались між собою. І в той же час нам треба для цього гроші, і ми співпрацюємо в пошуку цих інструментів. Така ключова наша задача, і ми бачимо в неї результат, оскільки ми послідовно від прийняття стратегії, національної стратегії протимінної діяльності у себе, ми рухаємось далі і далі. І я сподіваюся, до 33-го року ми досягнемо цих результатів.
Thank you, Dimitro. I will come to France. Monsieur l'ambassadeur, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur l'ambassadeur. D'abord, je voudrais vous remercier d'avoir organisé cet atelier extrêmement intéressant, parce que la question des coûts et de l'efficacité de la lutte contre les mines est particulièrement intéressante. À cet égard, d'ailleurs, je voudrais signaler à l'ensemble de l'audition de l'audience que lorsque la France avait présidé le Mine Action Support Group en 2022, elle avait financé une étude de GICHD qui est disponible sur le site de GICHD sur l'efficacité opérationnelle de la lutte contre les mines, avec énormément de chiffres extrêmement intéressants et qui montrent qu'il y a encore énormément de progrès à faire, puisque les coûts au mètre carré de déminage varient énormément selon les pays, pas seulement à cause des conditions géographiques, mais aussi parce que parfois il y a un mauvais usage des instruments. On dépense beaucoup d'argent à déminer des terres dans lesquelles il n'y a pas de mines, parce que par exemple, les études non techniques n'ont pas été faites suffisamment bien auparavant. Et donc, je vous renvoie à cette étude. J'ai été très intéressé par l'exposé remarquable de notre ami ukrainien, et je serais intéressé, comme j'imagine toute l'assistance, par le fait de pouvoir disposer du lien du site internet pour que l'on puisse étudier ce mécanisme d'enchère et voir comment fonctionne ce mécanisme extrêmement intéressant qui a été mis en place. Enfin, je voudrais faire une remarque sur le terme de financement innovant. J'ai tendance à penser que ce terme complique un peu les choses parce que, d'abord, je ne suis pas très d'apporter à penser que l'innovation financière crée de l'argent. À part M. Madoff qui est en prison, je n'ai pas l'impression que les crédits viennent de l'innovation. Si on regarde l'ensemble des opérations qui nous sont présentées comme des financements innovants, c'est-à-dire celles menées par Apopo au Cambodge avec des cultivateurs de riz, celles qui sont menées en Ukraine avec des producteurs céréaliers qui récupèrent leurs terres. Si on regarde bien, finalement, ce n'est pas l'innovation qui apporte des crédits nouveaux, c'est le fait qu'il y a des bénéficiaires qui financent le déminage parce qu'ils y ont un intérêt personnel. C'est qu'il y a une économie réelle derrière, pas vraiment de l'innovation financière, tout simplement parce qu'il y a des bénéficiaires. Alors je veux bien concevoir effectivement qu'une compagnie pétrolière qui va faire des forages a intérêt à déminer autour de chez elle, qu'une compagnie d'extraction minière qui va extraire de l'or, du fer, de l'aluminium a intérêt à déminer, qu'un groupe hôtelier à qui on attribue une côte paradisiaque au bord de la mer ou un site à proximité d'un site patrimoine de l'UNESCO a intérêt à déminer pour pouvoir retirer des bénéfices. Et je pense qu'il faudrait que l'on fasse éventuellement deux choses. D'une part, que l'on réfléchisse aux concessions minières. Je sais qu'il existe des associations qui réfléchissent au protocole que doivent respecter les grandes compagnies d'extraction minière. Et on peut imaginer, par exemple, dans un pays comme la République démocratique du Congo, que l'on puisse inciter à ce que dans les concessions accordées aux entreprises, il y ait des codes de bonne conduite pour faire du déminage humanitaire autour des zones et pas seulement pour la route qui va servir à transporter le minerai. Et ce sont des choses, vu l'ampleur des moyens financiers en cause dans l'exploitation minière, qui peuvent avoir une perspective. Et pour le reste, je pense qu'il faudrait que l'on réfléchisse en priorité moins à la technique de l'innovation financière qu'à d'abord repérer partout où il y a des bénéficiaires directs qui seraient prêts à payer pour le déminage de leurs terres parce que, à échelle de 10-15 ans ou 20 ans, avec un taux de remboursement possible, elles peuvent financer. C'est le cas des exploitants céréaliers en Ukraine, qui est un pays riche d'exportation de céréales, des producteurs de riz en Casamance ou au Cambodge, et dans d'autres endroits du monde où il y a un intérêt direct dans une économie réelle, pas trop difficile à comprendre pour des gens intelligence limitée comme moi, où on peut comprendre beaucoup plus facilement qu'il y a des sources de financement parce qu'il y a des bénéficiaires directs du déminage. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Merci, l'ambassadeur. I think in our business, we're always looking for the bumper sticker that tries to sort of capture in a couple of words what we're trying to achieve. But I think, as you illustrated there, what really is important is the substance that lies behind that. And what we're talking about is trying to find new and alternative ways of funding different aspects and different characteristics of our demining collective endeavours. I don't see any more requests for the floor, and I'm conscious I do have one request for the floor, sorry.